Okay, welcome to part 2 of this episode of our 2 minute tips. This time we're going to be looking at Aperture. Right, so what is the aperture part of the exposure triangle? Well, simply put, the aperture is the amount of light that your lens allows through to the sensor. So previously it was the amount of light that your shutter let through to the sensor. This one is your camera lens setting. And the aperture is the simple setting that goes from, normally it's about 2.8 all the way up to 22. Can go higher either way. I'm just going to show you the diagram just up on the corner of the screen here. So here's a picture of the aperture diagram, and as you can see that it goes from 2.8 all the way to f22. That's how we measure aperture stops with an f number. And as you can see from where the number is lower on the diagram, you see that the aperture has a very wide open circle, and as it goes higher and higher and higher, you can then see that the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is the setting of the aperture and how much light is coming through that circle at one time. So then if your number is nice and low, then you know that you're getting a lot of light come through to the sensor. If your number is high, then you know you're getting a smaller amount of light coming through to the sensor. Now, there's a second part to the aperture that really needs to be paid attention to as well. And as you can see underneath the diagram here, you can see like a little blurry figure, and then it gets sharper and sharper and sharper as well. So then you need to know that the lower your aperture number is, the yes, you're getting a lot more light into your camera, you can have a faster shutter speed, but also you're going to have a smaller focus plane, so you're going to have a smaller depth of field. So then you need to think about how high you want your aperture to be on the scale to how much focus that you also want there to be. So back to the example of myself sitting here. So then quickly look at my screen, and my setting is an aperture of 3.2 on this one, because I've got a little bit different lighting, so I can have a higher aperture. And for me, I want just me to be focused, and I want everything behind me here to be more blurry. So as I look at my screen and have a look at my recording, then I can see that here obviously you can still see my little logo, which is quite nice for you, and aesthetically it's a bit better than just nothing in the background. But like I said, it's blurry back there, and it's a little bit messy too, so it helps that it's all blurred out. So then I've managed to pick the right aperture setting for myself so that I stay in focus as the key point, and the rest of the beam behind me does not need to be in focus at all, because it's not quite relevant to my little talking head YouTube video, is it? But anyway, what we're going to do is have a look at these images and look at how setting your aperture can determine how you go ahead with the rest of your image. So I'm going to flip onto the screen and then have a look. I'm going to talk you through the 4 or 5 images that I've got and explain what we're doing with the aperture. Right, so first image that we've got is my final one, and what we're talking about here is that we've got the main subject nice and sharp, and that's grouped right at the front, and then you can see that what I've done is got some fairy lights in the background, just as an example of what we can actually do when we're separating our subject from the foreground using a shallow depth of field. So you can see that my settings are down at a 50th of a second, ISO is 400, and the f-stop is 1.4. So if we then moved across and I change the f-stop now to 2, we can see how it's got a bit darker. We can still see the sharpness in Baby Groot. We can still see that the background's blurred, but what we've actually done is, before where we couldn't see the wiring so much, we've now brought out a bit more detail in the background. So now because we've increased the depth of field, we can see a bit more detail in the background, but we've also now stopped a little bit more light coming through to the lens, to the sensor, sorry, through the lens. So then if we stepped it up again to 2.8, then obviously yes, it gets a bit darker, but we can still see some detail in the image. But now we can see more detail in the background, and everything's not as blurry anymore. You're starting to make out the wires and the lights, and then we do it again, and then obviously now the foreground isn't so prominent. We can still see the outline of Baby Groot in his little pot, but we can now see a lot more detail in the background as well. So we can see here that his little silhouette is now not as well lit because we're not letting enough light in. And then if we go to the final image, it's taken at f5.6, as the last one was f4, and we can still see some detail there. We can still read the front of Baby Groot's pot, but we can also now see a lot of detail in the back and a bit more of the actual wiring of the fairy lights. So when we're talking about aperture, this is what we're looking for in when we're trying to expose to the right settings in our triangle. So there you can see how the aperture affects what we're trying to do in terms of getting enough lighting and having our foreground background separated the right way. So I liked how it looked at 2.8. What the other settings were there was an ISO of 400 and a shutter speed at 1/50th. Right, so all of those pictures were taken with the exact same lighting on that image, and you can see how much changing your aperture number can really play a key role in how well lit your image could be. And I just had a light in front and a light just behind facing the little Baby Groot in the pot, and it really worked well when you had it exposed correctly, but as soon as you started closing the aperture, trying to get a bit more detail in the image, then it really struggled to get the light in, and we were still at very low numbers. So you can understand how I kept the lighting to a bare minimum and very weak, just to show you that how bad it can actually be if you're in a poorly lit area and you're trying to get some detail into your image. So that's a quick look at aperture. Don't forget, when we're looking at the aperture, we're also looking at how much we're actually having in focus, what we want in focus, what we don't want in focus. That was our 2-minute tip on aperture. So don't forget, we've got one more left in this little 3-part series of our 2-minute tip on the exposure triangle, and it's going to next up is going to be ISO.